February the 24th, 2022. Following up on yesterday's video, it kind of becomes somewhat obsolete within a day in some ways, although some of the analysis in it I think was still pretty good because I looked at the different levels of what might happen. And of course, I think we now see what's going to happen. I was saying yesterday the calm before the storm because I was like, it seemed like there was this kind of a waiting period there, but we now know the Russians have pretty much launched the full-scale attack on Ukraine. It's I think the full-scale scenario, not one of the more limited ones I discussed. And perhaps the reason for that was that he probably, and I'm speaking of Putin, probably calculated that no matter what he did, he was going to get hit with about the same level of sanctions, more or less, or pretty heavy, and therefore, rather than dragging it out forever, just get it over with. And the thing is, I'm not completely, let's say, opposed to the theory that perhaps he really got himself trapped, that he thought he was in a strong negotiating position and thought that our side would be accommodative, let's say, and since we weren't, he's simply left with what does he do? Completely lose face and perhaps be overthrown, or go ahead and attack. I mean, and that's the thing that I'm kind of ready to address here. By the way, if you like these videos, again, please subscribe. If you can give me a like if you want to help out with the algorithm so more people see them, and all comments are appreciated. I guess my position is somewhat of a controversial one. It's pretty much like General Flynn's, and I think he's put out a statement, which I might put a link to in the description below, and as well as maybe a link to yesterday's video too, just to kind of, for anybody that's interested that haven't seen it already. But essentially, the way I see it is that you look at the statements that way everybody sees it. I mean, I think, as I understand, Putin has made a bunch of really crazy statements about that his mission was to go in there and to denazify the country, to address the threat that Ukraine posed to Russia, and a variety of other issues of that sort. And of course, it's on its face, this is kind of laughable, I guess. But again, the idea, as Tucker Carlson points out, the idea that this Ukraine is a great democracy is probably another somewhat quasi-interesting situation, because the main opposition leader is in prison right now, or arrested or whatever. So, and that's not saying there wasn't a reason to do it. Maybe they thought he was a collaborator with the Russians. I mean, it's a country that was obviously under stress even before the invasion occurred. But the point, so there's all these hyperbole on all sides. I mean, and of course, that just kind of goes with the territory here. My only point has been that the whole catastrophe for the Ukrainian people could have been avoided pretty much, I think, if they simply would have acceded to the idea that they would not become part of NATO and make a commitment not to, and for us to make a similar commitment that they wouldn't be let into NATO. And support the position of neutralizing Ukraine, that is neither not allied with Russia nor with NATO, to be a neutral buffer zone, similar to what Finland and Sweden are, similar to Austria, and I guess to some extent Switzerland. There's no reason why. I mean, as we can see right now, the aspiration to be in NATO didn't really protect them, and it's unclear what might have happened if they'd been put in NATO. I mean, we might have had a wider war, NATO versus Russia, and that would even be worse, I think. Of course, we could argue that they would be deterred from trying anything like that. Perhaps more than likely, though, what would have happened is on the verge of it, something could have been triggered. Who knows? I would say even in the pre-war conditions of a few days ago, Ukraine really couldn't have been brought into NATO for the simple reason that Russia had already occupied Crimea, and currently Ukraine and the international community finds this to be illegal. Okay, Ukraine claims that that's part of their sovereign territory. So if they were let into NATO, they would probably immediately invoke Article 5, claiming they were invaded, I assume. You see the point. So that would immediately trigger the war between NATO and Russia. not because of any action. So that's another aspect of this thing that isn't discussed a whole lot, but which ought to be. I think that Russia's achieved a similar situation with Georgia, but taking in a little area in the north of Georgia, and again, the same situation could occur, although, again, it's unclear exactly what that conflict would be if it occurred. I mean, would the objective of NATO be to conquer Russia? I mean, would it be to just wage more likely a naval warfare and blockade them? I mean, that's kind of what happened during the phony war period of World War II after the German invasion of Poland. As we recall, what happened at that point was there was almost no action other than a few skirmishes on the Maginot Line and so forth in France. And then after that, essentially, what became a waiting game for months and during time. And so, but what did happen that wasn't a waiting game is Britain pursued a fairly aggressive, naval blockade against Germany, of course. And so the naval aspect, for which NATO, which is primarily the United States, and let's throw Britain in too, and maybe even France, but has a tremendous naval advantage. And so I think in that scenario, of course, if they went that way, you would first have a naval battle, and that could entail some substantial losses on both sides. Ultimately, I suspect the complete destruction of the Russian surface fleets, and then a lot of submarine warfare that would kind of be damaging to the world economy. Let's put it that way. Not saying that would be good for Russia at all, but I do mean it would be a nice situation. But anyway, at any rate, so we're stuck with a situation. It looks like that President Biden has put out his list of economic sanctions, which are pretty serious. But the problem is, it still remains that so much of Europe is dependent at this point in time on energy supplies, oil and natural gas from Russia, that to actually say, no, we won't take any of that, would actually tremendously stifle their economies and put them on rationing, basically. I mean, I don't think they could really survive it in the short term without a major economic impact. And so, hence, the sanctions aren't quite what certain people I've been hearing on TV on the conservative side would like to see. But the problem is you can't really keep unity in that environment. And I think that the most important strategic thing to do at this point, since it's happened, I think it could have been avoided, but it's happened, I think is that the key thing is to keep NATO together, to develop a consensus and to engage in those policies that most of our the whole NATO alliance and the European community agrees upon. I mean, a victory for the Russians would be if NATO were to split up and go different ways at this point, and that would be a disaster. And as far as I've been hearing a lot of really crazy fears that, like, well, Russia's just going to go on and they're going to attack this or attack that. Very unlikely. They're going to be pretty busy with Ukraine for a long time. There's a lot of angry Ukrainians that have a lot of small arms and weapons, and at this point, the Ukrainian army is still in the field fighting, I think, pretty effectively. We don't really get any read on what the real battles are like. We know certain things have been captured by the Russians, the Chernobyl plant. I think they're trying to get major power plants so they can control electricity inside of Ukraine. I mean, this is going to be a nasty affair at this point. It's an ugly thing has been unleashed, and it's going to make the Russians look really bad because they are kind of bad. What do you say? But, this is what happens when people don't come to, reasonable agreements here. And I think the Russians may have been unreasonable, but it wasn't that unreasonable to say, hey, let's cease this pushing to the east of the NATO alliance, especially pushing into areas which would be hard pressed to defend. I mean, if there really was an attack on the Baltic states, I don't see really how we could defend them. All we do is suffer a loss and be in a battle somewhere in Poland, probably. And that would not be a good situation. And like I said, the naval aspects of it and the possibility of nuclear escalation, all of which is dangerous and bad. But at the same time, I don't think any of that's going to really happen. I guess we're somewhat lucky, in my opinion, not to say anything good about Biden, but because he isn't that highly motivated to be a confrontationalist, I think it'll get contained inside of Ukraine. And eventually, it's hard to know how this ends. Will Russia eventually just leave because the Ukrainians reject their occupation? or will the occupation actually stifle Ukraine? It's just hard to say. I mean, I think we can say one thing, that's going to be a costly affair for the Russians and for the Ukrainians. And to me, this could all have been avoided over a basic idea of membership in an organization that really wouldn't be able to directly protect them anyhow. I mean, they're getting all the economic sanction support that they would have got pretty much if they were in there, and actually having a wider world conflict, I don't think is necessarily a great idea. I guess one could say that, well, that this just would not have happened, but I don't know. I think there are possibilities there that are still dangerous. I mean, I do agree that Russia has made a tacit nuclear threat that if there was a serious attempt to bring them down, it could escalate. And that's why, although it sounds like a great idea to do this, I think at the same time it really isn't. And what we need to also not lose our eye on is the Chinese. The Chinese probably loves this distraction, which they, and Taiwan is far more strategic to us because we get so many of our electronic components from Taiwan. And on the good side, I really think that China is not really militarily prepared to actually take Taiwan, but I think we should work to increase Taiwan's defense capabilities in order to avert any similar event happening on that theater. Particularly because you can't just drive across a border into Taiwan. You have to cross 100 miles of ocean. And there could be some real obstacles put in that ocean, I think. It would be smart for Taiwan to invest in some modern submarines. These so-called air-independent submarines would be excellent additions to their defenses, in my opinion. But at any rate, I'll digress at this point. I'm getting into all that and just wrap this up. I do have, like I say, descriptions of links to my social media, and I'll put a link to the Flynn statement and to my previous video on this subject, which kind of goes into a little bit of my analysis of the ongoing potential conflict. But now that it's ongoing, it's no longer anything else. Sad. It's a sad day, and a lot of people are going to die out of this. It's just horrible. But what can I say? At any rate, I just think it was bad strategy all the way through.